the interesting thing is you're not just learning from Mark. You're learning from all the people that Mark's learned from. And so, Mark, on your podcast, Humans 2.0, you've interviewed hundreds of people and some of the smartest, sharpest minds on the planet. And that's the thing. So Mark has done a really good job of accumulating a tremendous amount of knowledge and wisdom from the greatest minds in the world. And he's learned how to communicate it in a way that I think all of us can really grab onto those golden nuggets. So when it comes to social anxiety, Kevin and I have watched Mark struggle to, and I mean struggle in a good way, write this book, research for this book, get this book out. It's about social anxiety. And when you learn from someone, you always got to understand, like, why am I learning from this person, and what topic, what are the things that this person knows best? And from my sense of awareness, I remember we interviewed him about social anxiety and it blew my mind. So Kevin also interviewed Mark for the audiobook, which I know will be launching soon. But when it comes to social anxiety, not only has Mark lived through it, but he's studied it. And then on top of that, he has a podcast where he's interviewed the most successful people in the world, introverts and extroverts alike. So we are super excited to have you, Mark, and the floor is absolutely yours unless Kevin has something else to say.
No, I just
thanks, man.
The first thing I think we should start with is, how did Mark Metry become the man he is today? And why did you write a book on social anxiety when you are so talented in podcasting or, creating businesses or any of that? Like, why was social anxiety such an important thing for you to share?
Before that, I just want to address something that Alan said. And, honestly, as a podcaster, I feel like I have sat through with a lot of BS. People talking to me about a lot of crappy ideas that don't really make sense. And so for me, whether it's a podcaster or a speaker or anything else I do, I'm just trying to put forth the ideas that I have seen that are the most credible, that work the fastest, that are just worth people's time. And so there's a lot of sifting, there's a lot of filtering through that I still do today. And it's always a work in progress. But I like to think that some of the knowledge that I've learned from a lot of other smarter people than me is worth something to the average person, depending on where they're from. Wait, Kevin, can you repeat your question? I totally forgot.
No. So you are a successful business owner. You're a TEDx speaker. You're on an Amazon series coming up. You're a top 100 podcaster in the entire world. What made you decide to write a book on social anxiety and talk so openly about, like, you're one of the most open people on LinkedIn in terms of your story. So what made you decide to go that route?
Yeah. So I mean, honestly, I know I'm going to write a lot of books, and this is my first book. And I personally feel that, each person listening in, we've all been dealt certain cards in life where you probably didn't have a choice. It's probably like how we were born, where we were born into, how we look, how we act, things that we're just sort of born into this life with. And I think that that's where a lot of our pain and a lot of our purpose can come from. And so for me, I mean, I had so many problems growing up, just like everyone else. But for me, a big one was social anxiety. I remember not being able to speak to people for like the first 18 years of my life, never really having any friends, never being a part of any kind of club, group, sport, anything, because whenever I tried to talk to people, my brain would just talk me out of it. And so for me, one of the reasons why I wrote this book, Screw Being Shy, is because, one, I personally feel like this area is really interesting in the sense of a lot of people think that being shy or being introverted is somewhat harmless, and society just has a lot of misconceptions. So if you look at what being an introvert means, being an introvert at the psychology definition means someone who is just predominantly focused on their internal world. They're more introspective and they gain energy from that, which is totally normal. I'm an introvert. I'm sure a lot of you guys out there are introverts too. And when it comes to being shy, generally speaking, is a natural human emotion of you're in a new situation, you are in a new position for the first time. And a lot of the times what ends up happening is You might feel a little bit shy if you push yourself outside of your comfort zone. If you're in front of new people, you can be shy every once in a while. Now, the reality is that if you take that and you look at what society says of that kid or that adult sitting by themselves in a cafeteria or in a library or in whatever, is doing so because he or she is a shy introvert, that very well might be the case. But the other case may be is that they have social anxiety and the rest of the world just labels them as an introvert and as shy. And they're actually a really social person and they want to talk to people, but their nervous system, their brain is not letting them. And so the reason why this is so detrimental is because when I went through this whole experience personally in my life, and then when I was able to pop on the other side of it, I realized how detrimental this was. You know, all these things that I do today, there's no way I'd be able to do them if I wasn't able to overcome my social anxiety and just be myself in front of whoever the hell I want to. And so the biggest thing that actually made me go out there and write the book is when I began to do research and I began to look at the data, it turns out that social anxiety is not only the most common anxiety disorder in America, it is also the most correlated with substance abuse as well as social isolation. And I remember for me, when I was 18, I had a ton of substance abuse. I was socially isolating myself all the time. And both of those, substance abuse and social isolation, both lead to suicide, where I was almost suicidal once upon a time in my life. And so taking a look at all these factors and then realizing that the people who suffer from this don't actually talk about it. This is very much one of the biggest issues, and yet it's sort of an invisible issue, is sort of terrifying. And so I've read a lot of books out there from psychologists, from behavioral experts, from networking masters who teach people how to be more confident on how not to have social anxiety. I mean, the reality is that I have yet to find a book that sort of speaks in common language that the average person can understand, but then is also not anecdotal and doesn't just give you a ton of like random shallow tips on like how to be more confident, but actually shows you how to get to the root cause of this and how to actually deal with this at a root cause level. And so, and also taking a science-based approach, you know, like I reference many scientific studies that talk a lot about the science that's out there, that's validated. And I remember I came up with this idea to write the book when I was speaking in LA, and someone came up to me after I was done speaking, and you know, they kind of stumbled up to me. They weren't making direct eye contact with me, and you know, they were speaking in a very kind of like soft tone, and they said, you know, "Hey Mark, I enjoyed your story, and I want to know, how did you go from someone who couldn't even talk to people to being able to speak very openly about very deep aspects of your life on a stage in front of 200 people?" And so that kept on happening to me again and again and again and again and again and again. And I mean, that's one thing, because a lot of times people will just walk up to me just to like take a photograph with me and be like, "Yo, what's your best advice for like an entrepreneur?" Just kind of like ask me some generic question. But I continuously saw this pattern of people who I would place in the bucket of being somewhat very introverted, super shy, maybe even having social anxiety, ask me this genuine question that I could see in their eyes took an insane amount of courage for them to just walk up to me and ask me this question. And so I was like, I got to write this book that can show people who experience this issue how to begin to take steps on their own if they feel like they can't see a therapist, they can't get professional help, or they're in a very mentally bad spot. And so the title of my book, Screw Being Shy, you know, I've gotten a lot of flack about it. People telling me like, "Oh, being shy isn't a bad thing, this, and that." The title of my book, Screw Being Shy, is meant to like signal to shy people and say like, "Hey, if you don't want to be shy anymore, I was able to do it. There's a totally proven scientific based way to get out of it and how to actually be yourself in front of other people and not lose your identity." And so there it is, Screw Being Shy.
So Kev, I wanted to jump in at some point, but I know you do as well. So, Mark, you can answer my question or Kev's first. I do have one though.
Just for
Go
those
ahead.
who weren't in the beginning here, anybody who has questions, either feel free to raise your hand and we'll choose you, or you can throw it in the chat. Myself, Alan, Tiff, or Amy will read it off to Mark. Just wanted to make sure that was known.
Absolutely. So my first question, Mark, just to kickstart it off here, you mentioned that a lot of the YouTube channels or different people in this space where they're trying to help people gain confidence, they don't necessarily get to the root cause. So can you go into, for everyone in here, what is the actual root cause from the science that you've studied?
Yeah, and I just want to say that I'm not like the spokesperson on confidence. I think confidence and social anxiety are two totally different things. And that's why a lot of people, they try to use these tactics to build confidence to treat their social anxiety, when in reality they're two totally separate things. And so when it comes to that, I think the main thing that people need to understand, and when you just look at the science, social anxiety is not something that randomly happens to you. It's not something you just like wake up, or it's not the same as being born as an introvert where all of a sudden you're a socially anxious person. The reality is, from a psychological standpoint, social anxiety is a coping response to psychological trauma that you experience. And to give you guys an example, personally for me, I grew up in like the inner city for most of my young life. And by the time I was about 9, 10 years old, my parents and we moved out, and we moved to Western Massachusetts into a super small town that had 5,000 people in it. And the really interesting part about this town was that there was no racial diversity whatsoever. Everybody at my school looked the same. Everybody was white. I was the only person that looked different. And also at that time, this was post 9/11 in America, and I'm Egyptian, I'm Middle Eastern. And so I just got destroyed by a ton of abuse, a ton of racism, like teachers, people just socially humiliating me as a young person. And so that really enabled my brain to just kind of descend into this mentality of nobody likes you, you're a loser. Also at that same time, when I began to develop those issues, I also had some physical health issues come up. Like I see a lot of kids in America today that have these, and usually these are quite correlated. Things like asthma, ADD, gastrointestinal problems, all these have to do with your mental health and your psychological health. And so this can happen to you, generally speaking, 10, 11 years old, but it can also happen to you as an adult too. And anything can trigger this, from you moving to a new school, your parents getting divorced, you enduring some sort of socially humiliating event. And so, yeah, that's how it happens. And the really interesting part that I want to note about this is, if you asked me when I was 18, did anything happen to you in your life that traumatized you, I would have said no. And the reality is what I've learned is, a lot of people who have experienced some degree of anxiety or depression have some sort of memory loss, because your brain is trying to forget about what happened to recreate this version of an identity for you. But the reality is that's usually not who you are. And so you're projecting this false version of who you are as a survival tactic. On top of that, the second thing that I want to note is that social anxiety is actually the reason why it's one of the most common fears, is because this is not like a new fear, right? Like, this is not like you scrolling through your Instagram and like comparing yourself. No, social anxiety is this ancestral fear that is in a majority of humans that were able to survive for this long. Because as we all know, if you look at evolutionary biology, human beings are group creatures. We survived by being in groups, by being in villages. And so if you spoke up against the leadership, if you spoke up against your tribe that you were in, a lot of the common punishments for disagreeing with people, especially the leaders back then, was them kicking you out of the group, social exile. And so our brains equated, okay, if the only way that we can survive is in a group, and if I say something that means I'm going to get kicked out of the group and like I have to live by myself, I'm going to die. And so that is another major part of it too. A lot of it has to do with our ancestors, our DNA. And it's a very, very, very common kind of result of things. But yeah, social anxiety is not random. It's a result of what happens to you because of our sort of flawed human ancestral brains.
So we have the first question in the chat box here. How can you help people or friends that you want participating with you more? Like maybe it's a family Zoom call, gatherings, or presentations. Keep the questions coming. That is a fire question.
Yeah. Honestly, to be quite frank, this is such a interesting, and even though it's a simple question, it's very complex because it really depends on the person. I've actually been on podcasts where the host, the interviewer, has told me that her brother had social anxiety and he killed himself. And so this problem can range from a lot of different people. And so if you have like maybe a younger kid who you have seen like is pretty shy, doesn't really have a lot of friends, just kind of like does his own thing, never wants to socialize, that's probably social anxiety. I think probably the worst thing that you could do is be like, just talk to more people or just like give them some very simple, overly direct command. I think the best thing is trying to help him or her just develop as a human being. I think that's the big thing. A lot of the times when it comes to this stuff, you yourself, even if you're a loving parent or friend, you really can't help people because it's mostly a psychological issue in their head. But if you help them become themselves, if you help them just develop themselves as a human being, if you're like, hey, you want to go for a walk like every Saturday and just talk about life for an hour, and they're able to create like a safe zone with you where they can talk about any ideas without the fear of being ridiculed, judged, or mocked, that is going to help someone exponentially throughout the years. And I recall back to like my life, and I'm pretty sure the only reason why I didn't kill myself and the only reason why I'm not a statistic is because one, my parents were always supportive of me. They never pushed me to talk to people. They were never like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you just act like the other kids? And then number two is I remember I had a best friend of mine who, at my worst, when I didn't want to hang out with anybody, he would literally text and call me all day. And he came to my college dorm room and he sat downstairs and he wouldn't leave until I came down and I talked to him. And so if you can just be a really good friend for someone, create a space where you can talk to him or her without judgment, ridicule, that can go a long way. And as you do that, then you can begin to expand it out and be like, hey, we've been going for a walk for like the last 6 months. I have this, I have like another friend of mine that's really interested in this stuff. Do you mind if he tags along with us? And if he says no, then be like, okay, no problem. But if he says, yeah, sure, maybe. And then you can one by one help them feel more safe and open in a safe setting. The last thing that I'll say is eventually, if you can get someone like that, maybe you can start to go to like an event with him or her and be like, hey, I'm going to be with you the whole time. I'm not going to leave your side. And that will slowly but surely begin to teach them, like at a surface level, how someone else can help them for sure. And a little goes a long way.
So we got some tactics here in the next question. Any daily habits that you implemented that you feel helped with your social anxiety?
Yeah. So probably the biggest one is, I can talk all about habits. I can talk all about like different things to do. But at the end of the day, what you really need to understand, especially when it comes to social anxiety or any other mental health problem, is you have to get your biochemistry right. You have to get your biochemistry, the back end of how your brain works, functioning properly. And what I mean is, in my book, I talk about this. I break down the research. And when you look at a lot of mental health problems, and even when you look at like the leadership community, like Simon Sinek talks about, they talk a lot about neurotransmitters. And essentially there's this theory that says part of life is how these different neurotransmitters are firing in your brain. And a super important neurotransmitter, this molecule that controls a lot of our lives, is called serotonin. And serotonin controls your mood. It controls your appetite. It controls your sexual desire. It controls your sleep. And it controls literally how you function in social groups. And so serotonin is extremely important for just general mental health, but extremely important for social anxiety. And when you look at the studies, they've shown that people who have social anxiety, their brain is either producing too much or too little of serotonin, or there is some other underlying dysfunction when it comes to serotonin. And so a lot of the previous solutions for tackling this have generally come with, okay, we have to look at the brain. We have to address how the brain processes these neurotransmitters. If you look at, for example, this emerging new field of science that's come out over the last 10, 15 years that Harvard calls nutritional psychiatry, they've actually found that most of your serotonin isn't even in your brain. Most of your serotonin is in this thing called the gut microbiome, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, but it is this ecosystem of bacteria between your intestines and your stomach that have formed a symbiotic relationship with human beings thousands of years ago that have made us the number one species on this planet. And so basically, whenever you eat a food, your human body parts don't process that first. Your bacteria eats that, and then it passes off the chemical output to the rest of your body. And so when it comes to serotonin, 90 to 95% of serotonin is in your gut microbiome. And so for me, when I talk about this in my book, this is labeled under the section of first my gut broke and then my brain broke. And I talk about the one time in my life where I was seriously depressed and I was suicidal and my social anxiety became social isolation is when I was abusing my body with alcohol, with junk food, with chronic stress, all these things that have been known to destroy your gut microbiome. And so I think one of the most basic and most foundational habits that I could tell someone is you really need to look at what you're eating. And a lot of people just sort of brush over diet in the bucket of like exercise, of like, yeah, make sure you exercise and you eat healthy. It's a lot more complicated than that. Eating healthy is an extremely important thing that I would even say goes above exercise to a lot of different people. And when it comes to like what you should be eating, the reality is there's no such thing as a universal healthy diet. There's no such thing as everyone should be on keto. Everyone should be on plant-based. Everyone should be on carnivore. Everyone should be on all these different diets. The one fad diet, the one diet that doesn't work is the diet that has emerged over the last 50 years. And that is eating industrialized foods. That is when you walk into a grocery store, you walk into a convenience store and you see a bag of candy, you see a bag of chips, and you take that bag over and you flip the ingredients. And there's like an entire essay and there's like 500 ingredients. And you're like reading all these things like diphosphate, tryptophan, red 6, yellow 5. All these ingredients to one person or another cause various side effects to your gut microbiome. And that for someone may be gaining weight. For another person, that may be getting anxiety. And so if people want a more comprehensive look at this, I recommend looking into this service called Viome, Viome, that is actually partnered with the US government to create this tool that can actually look inside your gut microbiome and it tells you specifically what is going on. And so, yeah, anyone who needs help with mental health, social anxiety, the first thing you need to look at is what you're putting in your body, is what you're eating, because that is unfortunately, it's not super popular today, or some people have like, oh, it's just about calories, or it's just about getting the right macronutrients, or it's just about this or that. No, the food that you eat literally sends messages to every single organ in your body and literally controls your neurotransmitters and your intuitive gut feeling that people talk about.
Which made it highly difficult because we started our mastermind at Dunkin' Donuts. If anybody knows me, they know I like my donuts. But honestly, between your book and knowing you, that has helped me tremendously in terms, like I do my micro shake every day now because of Mark. And I was lucky enough to read the book too. So that is absolute fire. Another question. So to what degree do you believe that cognitive distortions play an effect on your social anxiety? We're going deep here.
Fire question.
Yeah. I appreciate that question. Who asked that? Bianca, I appreciate that question. I can tell you've actually read my book because that's like an entire chapter that I break down.
I actually haven't read the book yet, but I study this in school, so I wanted your take on it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I talk about this entirely. And from my understanding, if you Google cognitive bias codex, you're going to see this massive chart that essentially breaks down the meta problems that we can have as human beings, in the sense of, one, our brain needs to operate quickly, because if you don't find information fast enough, then in a survival position, if you act slow, you're going to die. Number two, sometimes we need to assume and create a story around the information that we may have but may not be complete. And so essentially, if you break it down, all of our life's problems can break down into these variety of meta problems that then our brain has developed over thousands of years, these mini backdoors and shortcuts to get us to cognitively think quicker, even though that may not be correct. One of the ways that I can describe this to someone is the same way that if you want to copy and paste something on the internet and you're like on your computer, and instead of just going over to text, highlighting it, and then right-clicking, and then finding copy, and then going to another document, right-clicking, and then hitting paste, a cognitive bias is essentially a shortcut that your brain takes where instead of doing that whole thing, it can just hit Control-C and then Control-V to do the same exact function. And so when our brain is performing billions of operations per second to keep us alive and to keep us from solving all these various problems, that can be wrong. And your brain can be wrong depending on many different issues, from the sense of what I talked about before, of if you have certain nutritional deficiencies, if your brain is inflamed, if you grew up in a family or a group of friends that told you, you know, all people that look like this are this way, and you create these stories of how people function, then the reality is that your brain then takes those shortcuts, it takes those backdoor little entrances, and it uses those to essentially keep you from living in this very fear-based black and white scarcity reality where, like, again, it's so interesting because the brain is the ultimate master. It knows you better than you know yourself. And the reality is like, I think back to when I was a kid, and if I was a kid and I heard what I was saying right now, I'd be like, this guy has no idea what he's talking about. All this stuff is BS. It doesn't even make any sense. It probably doesn't even work. And the reality is because your brain is like this ultimate defense mechanism that constantly creates these stories, that constantly creates these models of a reality that may be right or may be wrong. And that depends on usually the earlier part of your life. It matters on how your psychology, your nervous system was formed. And so yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know how many there are. I think science says, like, I mean, Bianca, you probably know this better than I do, but I think science says there's anywhere from 68 up to 300 different cognitive biases and distortions. And so, yeah, if you Google cognitive bias codex, you will literally see what it is that I'm talking about. And like the most clear example of this is the negativity bias of, if 10 people walk up to you today and 9 of them say, you know, you're awesome and you're a great person, but then one person walks up to you and they say, you suck, your brain is going to constantly focus on that one negative thing that it heard, even if that information isn't necessarily valuable to you. But there's another bias that says, or it's the same bias, that negative information is more useful and you shouldn't overlook it. And so essentially, social anxiety is this product of us living in our modern world, us sitting down all day, us being disconnected, us putting our bodies with a ton of pro-inflammatory foods that destroy our brain, alongside this super ancient neurobiology that has taught us to, connect with people, but then also to be afraid of people because you don't know who's in it or who's out for you. And so it's a super interesting topic, but I'm glad I got that question, Bianca.
Going deep here. Okay, so we have two questions, but they're kind of similar, so I'm going to try to connect them. So I understand when you say that social anxiety is from past trauma, but what about trauma for somebody who is just sexually abused, or somebody who has a physical deformity, or they're in an environment where they're being discriminated against on a daily basis? That's part one. And then the second part from somebody else is, if social anxiety is a response to a trauma you've experienced, how can somebody work through that anxiety if they're still experiencing that trauma? So they're kind of similar questions.
Okay, so to address the first one, you know, I think one of the greatest things is that I don't like talking about things I don't know what they are. And so personally for me, I haven't really had any traumatic events happen to me the last several years that would flare up my social anxiety. And so if you see yourself in a very negative, toxic environment, unfortunately, I don't think I'm the person to answer that question. I know, especially right now, because of what's going on, and a lot of people are stuck at home, and a lot of people are experiencing things from domestic abuse to being around people who put them down. On a more serious note, I would say to go speak to a therapist, a psychotherapist, because I'm definitely not that person. On a lighter note, in the sense of like, if you're not in a toxic environment, but you are surrounded by people who don't really get what you're doing, who may like say some negative things about you, I'm a big believer of sometimes you have to shut out your environment if possible. Like, for example, I remember for me when I was 18 and I was beginning to realize a lot of these things about myself, and I began to talk to my friends and family about this. They were like, dude, what the hell are you talking about? Like, you don't know, like, you don't know what it is you're talking about. Like, this stuff doesn't make any sense. And so from that perspective, I would say I'm a big believer of shutting out the world around you. I remember for me, when this was happening, I maybe spent a period of just kind of 6 months in my own head, listening to podcasts, reading books, finding some way to connect myself and disconnect myself from people who didn't believe in that. And Kevin, what was the second question?
So the second question, well, AK, did you want to ask a follow-up to the first?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the follow-up to that was, we never really maybe realize what trauma somebody's going through. And if somebody is going through something, and the reason that they're shy, let's say, for example, there's a female, for example, that just got, sexually assaulted. And it might have been in that same environment where it happened again. And now she has to go back into that environment. So how do you deal with that where it's not just psychologically, there might be actual fears that she has? So yeah, that's my question. Like, how do you deal with shyness or trauma when it's still kind of very, very present, very, very current, very, very recent?
Yeah. So, again, I just want to say that I'm no expert in trauma whatsoever. I would tell you to check out people like Mastin Kipp, or check out Dr. Nicole LePera. She's the holistic psychologist on Instagram. But what I would say is this. I mean, the one thing that I could relate to that is, sometimes for me, because, one of my triggers is race. Someone who, or not race, race. Like sometimes if I'm in an environment where nobody around me looks like me, parts of my brain are like, dude, you look different from people. get out of here, run away. And so what I would say is that going through that trauma is a lifelong process. And the reality is whether it is psychotherapy, whether it is working with a professional, whether it is kind of doing these other things that I talked about, like nutritional psychiatry, focusing on your nervous system, looking at your breath, it is all really a part of the lifelong healing process. And the reality is that unfortunately, your triggers are your teachers. And of course, you can lessen a degree of a trigger, but we're always going to have those triggers. And so ideally, I would say is change your environment. That sometimes is the best way to go about it, because the reality is that this life is definitely not fair. Or try to put yourself in a group, try to surround yourself with people where you feel safe, you feel connected to, if you have to go back to those environments. For example, I had a close friend of mine who was sexually assaulted after she left a club like 2-3 years ago. And now she doesn't go to clubs. And you could say like, that sucks, but that's her part of her journey, and we're all on a different part of our journey. And so part of it is just looking at yourself through this holistic lens of, when you heal yourself, it's not like this thing that you can do in a year or two. Of course, you can make great improvements, but this is a lifelong journey. Surround yourself with people who have been through this. If you're in a very negative state, and if you're in a state where you're still traumatized, you need to go seek professional help, because there are very clear methods that have been outlined as a way to sort of reverse and reset your nervous system. And that can look different for each person.
Well, I mean, to kind of with that, what would you have told Mark when he was in high school, when he was going through these difficult moments, and let's say you didn't have the money to get that type of treatment? So what would you have told yourself 10 years from now as you're going through that trauma?
That's a great question. Yes, I mean, so I didn't have the money. What I would have said is probably would have somehow switched schools, maybe homeschooled, probably talked about it to different administrators, different leaders in that group. And honestly, I would have told him to accept the fact that it's okay to feel like you're judged and you're in this stuck position. And the most important thing is that you process it, in the sense of like, personally for me, I didn't really talk about these problems with anybody. And I feel like if I had someone that I could have talked to about it, where I was in a safe position, that I at least felt safe, that would have been much better. And then also, of course, like trying to learn about these things myself, trying to read, whether it's read books or watch documentaries, or just try to surround myself with as much information, knowledge on how to process and how to go through this. Because the reality of the fact is I can give someone like 5 different habits or 5 different ways to begin for them to slowly heal from this process. But at the end of the day, it is a process. And for me, I feel like if I maybe had that same traumatic event or the same traumatic environment, and I was maybe placed in an environment that prioritized growth, that prioritized healing, then maybe I could have had people help me around me a little bit earlier, a little bit closer. But the reality is you just need to learn about these things yourself, from an emotional standpoint, from a mental standpoint, from a physical health standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint as well. I mean, I would tell people to read books by people who are psychotherapists. I would tell people to really go deep in this, for sure.
Alan and I can definitely connect you to a psychotherapist as well. I think and that's always the goal, right? To make sure that we're sharing. That's what we're doing here. Like, Mark is a friend and he's been a guest and he's here. If we can help in any way when it comes to this sort of thing, please, I'll speak for myself, Alan. I don't know if you're in the same boat, but please reach out to me and I'll connect you with anybody I can. Okay. So Bianca's hard hitting with the questions here. She's practicing for her own podcast. For someone
AK, real quick, AK, someone's getting feedback. AK, I think you might want to mute.
So
I don't know if it's you, but I've looked through the room. I think everyone else is muted. Okay, we're good now. Thank you.
for someone who can't afford therapy and doesn't necessarily have access to a therapist, and they don't have people around them to push them in the way that you previously mentioned, what kind of behavioral activation techniques do you suggest that people can implement on their own? Jesus B.
I mean, I don't know what behavioral activation techniques mean, but
Behavioral activation is exposure therapy.
okay, cool. So, I mean, it's really interesting because I have an entire chapter on exposure therapy, and the way that I break it down in the book is I did it by myself. Of course, if you have someone, that can be good. So, I mean, one is I would say this. Thankfully, today, due to technology, there are a lot of platforms out there who are giving people access to therapists that don't normally have them at a reduced cost. And so I would definitely say do some research. There are definitely more options today than there were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Number two is, like, again, what I said before of when I was going through this, I didn't really see a therapist. I went and I saw my college's on-campus doctor, and I didn't really follow his advice. But aside from that, I did a lot of these things that I talk about by myself. And that was a product of like literally just like I was thinking about this today. I probably didn't talk to anybody for maybe about like 6 months. Like I literally put myself in my room with this sole mentality of every single day I'm going to wake up and I'm going to try to develop myself. I'm going to try to learn as much as humanly possible about psychology, rewiring your brain, your physical, mental, emotional health. And so I think that's a massive part of it. And in terms of exposure therapy, I talk about this in terms of social anxiety, obviously, in my book. And for me, I tried to, at first, I tried to go out there and just talk to random people. When I was 18 and I tried to talk to random people and I realized I had social anxiety and I tried to do that, it actually made my problems worse because I was facing so much stress from my nervous system. And it wasn't until I began to go deep into my biochemistry, what I was talking about before when it comes to like your neurotransmitters, that then I was able to what I call give myself a biochemical runway to begin to ease up the fight or flight response for my nervous system. And so what I would say, and I talk about this in my book, chapter 4 of my book, is biochemistry is your biggest starting leverage point, in the sense of if you have a fear, if you have an anxiety that you've always had your entire life, it's not like you can just go outside and just like expose yourself to that and just get over it in a day. No, it takes a lot of work. And I know for me, when I tried to do that, it made me stress out way, way more. And so for me, after I had tackled my nutrition, after I had looked at my gut microbiome, after I started to sleep well, exercise, meditate, then that finally gave me the capacity or the bandwidth to, oh God, AK, I just saw your question. Jesus Christ. That finally gave me the bandwidth to be able to take the logical part of my brain and to begin to break down my ability to expose myself to these fears. So for example, I remember I whipped out my journal and I was like, hey, Mark, today you're going to talk to 5 random people in the street. And I remember going outside and I tried to talk to people and it was just like, I literally couldn't do it. Like I would walk up to people and I was like about to say something, but then my brain would just talk me out of it. And that literally happened every single time. I couldn't undo it. And it wasn't until I broke it down into more logical steps where I was like, hey, Mark, go outside and ask 5 people what the time is right now. And I went outside. Eventually, I was able to do it because it wasn't that open. It gave my brain something to focus on. It was a very direct, logical question. And I asked them that question, and then I did it again and again and again and again. And then I went back to the drawing board, and I was like, hey, Mark, ask ask someone what the time is, and then also how to get to directions to like that cafe that's like right there that I can kind of see. And then I did that, and then it was like, hey, Mark, ask 10 people directions, what the time is, and then see if you can leave them a compliment. See if you can say like, hey, that's a nice bag, or hey, you know, you got like a Taco Bell bag, that's nice food. I don't know, some like random kind of compliment. And so eventually I break this down in my book, and there are certain steps that people can follow if they've taken the right steps previously, depending on the person, depending on their past, depending on their experience, that can definitely help them ease up to then eventually expose themselves. And the last thing that I would say to that is specifically when it comes to social anxiety, there are 4 layers to social anxiety. 1, there is your physical appearance. Number 2, there is social anxiety about your social skills. So some people feel like they have no social skills, and someone walks up to them, they don't know how to start a conversation. Number 3, it's number 3 is you get socially anxious about your character, your personality. You feel like you're empty. You feel like you have no worth. And then the last one is you get socially anxious about the signs of anxiety itself. And it kind of turns into this feedback loop where you're trying to be social, you're in this conversation, and the next thing you know, you're sweating, you feel your heartbeat start pounding, and then your brain is like, wait, why is my heartbeat pounding? Why am I sweating? Oh my God, can people tell that I'm socially anxious? And that makes you even more socially anxious. And so a big part of it too is looking at each one of those layers and tackling it one by one by one. And so, for example, the first one, your physical appearance. Again, going back to sort of my trauma, a big reason why I have social anxiety is because I faced a lot of racism. And obviously, it's not like I can change my race, right? So you can't really work on that one. However, I remember a big part of it was I remember not really having much money when I was growing up, but yet the place where I lived was a very interesting place, socioeconomically speaking, where there were a lot of people who did have money. And I remember getting picked on, getting bullied because people made fun of me because I would wear the same clothes to school over and over again because I didn't have much money to like buy out a new wardrobe. And so I remember one of the things that I began to do to begin to tackle this was I literally began to wear the craziest clothes in like the most public scenarios. Like I would go to the most crowded mall, I would go to the most crowded area, and I would literally wear like a bright pink t-shirt with like super tight shorts, things that I would never wear, just to condition my brain to not care what other people think about me. The second one, when it comes to social skills, I literally have an entire chapter in my book that's called Learning How to Be Human, where I literally break down the different social skills, different things from body language to vocals that you need to learn to be able to function as a human being with social anxiety. The third one, about your character and your personality, that has a lot to do with you just growing yourself as a human being. That has to do with you building up your self-esteem. That has to do with you building up your self-confidence, you developing values, priorities, morals, a lot of these things. And so usually when you do those things, usually the last one can sort of just go away by itself. But yeah, there are real steps that I would say to begin to expose yourself to each one of these layers. And I break it all down in the book.
We got
Real quick,
8 minutes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Quick.
Just real quick. So I'm sure you have a lot of data, or maybe you do or don't, on it's just like the 4 tendencies by Gretchen Rubin. Like, what are the 4? Which one of these is the most common in terms of social anxiety? I know that we all have all 4, but which one's the big hitter, and why?
Honestly, I'm not too sure about that one, Alan. I mean, I've read Gretchen's book. I've done her test. I've had her on my podcast. But honestly, the real interesting part about social anxiety is that, dude, I know extroverts that have social anxiety, and it's like literally like this like self-conflicting crisis that they are in. And so I've seen a lot of people that have social anxiety, from people who have millions of followers, who feel like they have a confident sort of physique or esteem, that have a lot of social anxiety, to people who look like they have social anxiety, who kind of look like they don't have any confidence. They're slouched down. They don't make direct eye contact. And so, yeah, that's a massive part of it too. So I don't really think that, at least from what I know, that there's like a specific kind of person for sure. Definitely introverts for sure are more susceptible to these things, but I've seen all different kinds of peoples and personalities have social anxiety.
All right, lightning round here. We got 7 minutes. So, hold on. Mo wants to know if you have ever used journaling as a mechanism to get to the root cause and then take steps to move forward.
Lightning round.
Dude, every day, man. Every day, bro. I journal every day after my meditation session because I find that after you meditate, your brain is just kind of reset and it's more open, and you can get into like much more deeper parts of your psyche after meditation when you journal, for sure. And like a lot of the times too, like as I try to write a letter to myself. I try to like just sit down with myself and just be like, yo, Mark, what's going on? And oftentimes when I do that, I can release and process a lot of emotions that usually the logical part of my brain doesn't let me access. So yeah, every day.
Okay. How much of an impact do you think your friends and family have regarding your social anxiety? For instance, is it beneficial to surround yourself with more outgoing friends, or would that be detrimental to you?
Yeah, so this is a phenomenal question in many different sense, right? So, personally for me, when I think back to it, I definitely had a lot of friends who were outgoing. I definitely surrounded myself with a lot of people who, they weren't like mean, they weren't like negative towards me or anything like that. But I definitely feel like part of that as a kid would always have me compare myself to them. And then also, if you're always with a certain person, let's say a sister or something who's like super, super, super outgoing, and you're like super, super shy and already have social anxiety. So I don't think that these things can cause social anxiety by any means, but I think they can make it better or worse, where it's like, why would you speak up if someone next to you is always going to do the speaking up for you? And then also I have seen in other situations where, like early on in my journey, where if I surrounded myself with people who were not confident at all, people who also had social anxiety, and maybe this is just me because I feel like I'm just a naturally caring person who has a big heart, I saw myself in multiple situations speak up and do things that I wouldn't normally do because I was like, okay, I'm the leader in this group. I'm the leader in this situation. I have to go out on a limb here and speak up or do things. And so that can be part of it too. But I think that is very much kind of like not like the biggest things that people should necessarily focus on unless it is inherently toxic or negative.
All right. Lightning round on psychedelics. Thoughts on psychedelics?
I'm not qualified to answer this question. I have had on two different doctors on my show, or no, one doctor and another guy by the name of Aubrey Marcus, who has spoken on psychedelics. All I would say is that I have seen some really interesting research around using these as potential treatment tools for people who have been like psychologically traumatized for decades and years. And there's like no way that they can make big strides in their improvement just by like changing their food or changing the way like that they talk to themselves. And so I feel like it's usually done in a much more serious case, but I'm definitely not an expert about it. And I would refer to people who are smarter than me.
Right on. Fire. Is there any last minute questions here? The chat box is clear. We have 3 minutes on the clock. If anybody wants to find a question.
Yeah, Mark, real quick. Tips.
Yo, Josh, what's up, man?
What's going on, Mark? Tips on overcoming social anxiety, right? Going through that journey, but also staying true to yourself.
Yeah.
What about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the most interesting things that I've learned is obviously this depends on how old you are, where you are in your journey, but I've really learned that, like there's that quote that says, life is not about finding yourself, it's about creating yourself. And I have like this whole chapter on my book on like authenticity and false confidence and masks. And I find a lot of the times, man, where let's say you're an athlete let's say you're an entrepreneur, let's say you're an artist, let's say you're doing whatever, a lot of the times you can be super confident in like your zone, in your environment. But then when you step outside of that, you have no confidence. You realize that this thing, that even though it's good, like let's say I'm a bodybuilder, let's say like going to the gym is good, you could have horrible social anxiety when you step outside of the gym. And so I think the biggest part to realize is that, I believe that our identity is not something that is really fixed. It's not like this thing that like you are, that like you're born with, that's like etched out to every single degree. It's something that you are constantly developing, creating within yourself. And I think the real trap to that is leaning into false masks, is leaning into false suits of armor. And like, to be honest with you, I see it all the time. Like my ego is constantly doing that, whether it's like, I'm an author now, and then people get to know me for these things that I talk about in the book. But then all of a sudden, when I'm not talking about those things, it's like, wait, what am I really speaking about? And it's super interesting. Like I've had the fortune of like speaking next to like a lot of great people, from like world Olympians to like New York Times bestselling authors to billionaires. And dude, the chats that I have with these people off stage, off camera, is super interesting. Like I'll have someone that like literally a speaker right next to me that says like, dude, you ever like, I like literally had this one speaker come to me and like break down crying. And he was literally like, dude, I feel like ever since I kind of became this person, I just can't be my normal self around people. And when normal people walk up to me, I don't have anything to talk to them about. And so it's like this constant journey of constantly realizing that like, you are not this person who you are born with, but you are a person that is someone that is constantly trying to create themselves. And so when it comes to that, the ability to not cling to any kind of mask, even if it's a good thing, to not cling on to any sort of label is a good thing. And just sort of having a real understanding of real humanity. I feel like a lot of us think like once we become speakers, or once we become podcast hosts, or once we become entrepreneurs, we should have all the confidence in the world and we shouldn't get socially anxious. The reality is that this kind of comes in two parts. One of, are you actually following your life's true purpose? Are you actually following what you should be doing on a moment-to-moment basis? Not just what gives you a ton of likes, or not just what gives you a ton of followers or gives you a ton of money. And then the second part of that is realizing that this is like a psychologically, like a science thing, like a biochemical thing of like, I've seen people who have been aligned with their purpose, have been living their truth, but they were depressed because they weren't taking care of their biochemistry. They were eating the wrong foods, drinking too much alcohol, not sleeping enough, not doing these certain things. And so those are sort of two sides of the coin that I would talk about, and I would mention, and always kind of checking yourself, always realizing it. And I remember in March, I was in New York City, and I was interviewing Jay Shetty before like this whole coronavirus thing happened. And he told me that your mind is like a garden, in the sense of like, whether you're growing a flower or whether there is a vicious weed that is growing up and can strangle and choke your flowers, none of that happens overnight. It happens step by step through the seed in the ground, and then it happens through the days of getting sunlight, and then it happens through the water. And so I feel like a lot of us, we know ourselves, when in reality, if you're not doing things like constantly trying to challenge yourself, meditating, journaling, doing like all the things that Alan and Kevin talk about all the time, you're going to have these weeds sneak up on you and control your ego, even if you feel like nothing wrong is happening. And that's exactly when you are the most susceptible. And so for me, I'm always thinking like, doesn't matter how many followers I got, doesn't matter how much money I have, doesn't matter how much happiness I achieve, doesn't matter my closest friends and family telling me around me how awesome I am and how much I'm supportive of them. That's awesome. but I can never let that get to my head, because when you do, that is when the real you begins to kind of let go, and you begin to get in all these influences that happen underneath the surface from like a psychological level, that just begin to happen and begin to grow weeds, and they just begin to take down your flowers. And so daily documentation, and when you do all these things, you are this vessel that water can pass through easily. And if you're not doing these things all day, the next time you get like some tainted water occur in your life, some event, it's not going to pass through you. It's going to get stuck. And so for me, that's why I'm always trying to learn. I'm always trying to grow. And the times where I feel like I am doing the best, and I begin to like let go of a lot of these habits that like got me here, like meditation, like working out, like eating healthy, then that's when I see my ego slip right in, and I'm not the authentic version of myself. And so, yeah, that's a massive part of what I would say, if that made sense, Josh.
Absolute fire, Mark. So a couple things. We just went over time. Number one, I know everyone probably wants to figure out where to find the book. Number two, if you guys have any additional questions that you want Mark to answer, you can put them in the chat. I will save the chat after this and make sure they get answered either offline, or we, pick his brain and then type it in. Kev, any parting notes?
No, I was going to say the same thing. If there's any other questions, even if you DM me or Alan, we're good friends with Mark. I'm sure he wouldn't mind answering a few more questions, and I'll type them out in Kevin way. So, but Mark, tell quickly, where can they find the book? All of that. Where can they find more about you? All of that, unless we already made you late for something.
Yeah. What I would say is anywhere that you go to buy books, Barnes and Nobles, Amazon. Yeah, I made a QR code. I don't even know if people can scan it or something like that. I don't even know if that works. It has got to be in a physical presentation.
Yep.
But yeah,
unless you can pull it up on the share screen, it's your call.
Nah. What I'll just do is I'll just put the link in the chat.
Perfect.
It is a fire
check
book.
out my book. If anyone wants to get in touch with me after, you're totally free to. Just go to my website, markmetry.com. Add me on LinkedIn. That's my biggest platform. Instagram is okay, I guess. But yeah, go to my website. That's where you can check out my podcast, everything I've got going on. And this was awesome. I can't believe it's been an hour.
Right, it
Talk
goes
about
by
flow.
so quick.
Mark, thank you so much for coming on. And we really appreciate this so much. That's definitely something that even if we personally are not dealing with, I know someone in our life is. So let's all support the people around us, support ourselves. And at the end there was absolute fire regarding the habits. So thank you so much.
You guys. At one point, I think we had 32 or 33 people in here. Best showing yet. You guys are the best. We do not have fans. We have family. We appreciate you guys so much. And Mark, same for you. You are family, my friend. We appreciate you.
Thank you all so much. Hyperconscious team, stay after. And anyone wants to leave their email in there, we actually have a private coaching call. Not a private coaching call, I'm sorry. We did a LinkedIn Live with David Meltzer. We just got the asset today, and I actually just downloaded it. And we're going to be emailing it directly to everyone who puts their email in the chat box. And thank you all so much.
Woo!
Right on.
Please let me know how it goes if anyone gets the book. And I love you guys all.
We love you too, Mark. Thank you so much, brother.